The first time the wagon came, it was a Tuesday. Abigail Thorne knew it was a Tuesday because that was the day she mended harnesses, the thick smell of neatsfoot oil clinging to her hands and the rough canvas of her apron. The sun baked the hard-packed dirt of the yard, and the air was still, heavy with the promise of more heat to come. The sound reached her first, a low, rhythmic rumble that was not the familiar clatter of a neighbor's buggy or the slow tread of her own aging mule. This was heavier, pulled by a team of 4, their hooves churning up a plume of arca dust that rose against the pale blue sky. She paused, needle halfway through a thick leather strap, and watched from the cool darkness of the barn doorway. The wagon, belonging to the Blackwood Tannery over in the next county, lumbered to a stop just beyond her fence line. A man she didn't know, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, climbed down. He didn't approach the house. He didn't call out a greeting. He simply walked to the back of the wagon, unlatched the gate, and wrestled a heavy burlap sack onto the ground. It landed with a dull, fleshy thud. He heaved another, and then a third. He retied the gate, climbed back onto his seat, and with a sharp crack of the reins, drove away, leaving the sack sitting in the rising heat. She stood there for a long moment. The dust settled. A fly buzzed near her ear. The silence of the farm rushed back in. Her late husband, Robert, had made some arrangement with the tannery foreman, something about carting away their waste for a small fee, but he'd passed before the first delivery could be made. She'd assumed the deal died with him. Apparently not. She walked out into the sun, her boots scuffing the dry earth. She untied the twine on the nearest sack and peered inside. Scraps. Hundreds of them. Offcuts of cowhide, oddly shaped and stiff, smelling of brine and chemicals and raw skin. They were the trimmings, the useless edges, the parts too small or too awkwardly shaped for making saddles or boots. They were trash. She retied the sack and dragged it, heavy and unwieldy, into the shade of the barn, her mind already turning over the problem. What was she supposed to do with this? She had a farm to run, fences to mend, a well that threatened to run dry with every passing week. She did not have time for someone else's garbage. She remembered Robert's voice, a low rumble like distant thunder, speaking to her one evening as he repaired a broken chair. Waste, he'd said, turning a piece of splintered oak in his hands, is just a resource you haven't found a use for yet. She looked at the sack, then at the vast, empty corner of the barn. With a sigh that stirred the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, she dragged the other 2 sacks inside and emptied them. The pile wasn't large yet, but it was a beginning. A strange, unwanted inheritance. A problem made of leather. Let me tell you about the years that followed. Every Tuesday, like a promise the world had made and she had not asked for, the tannery wagon would appear at the end of the long dirt road. The driver, a different man now, would pull up, dump his load of 3 or 4 sacks, and leave without a word. The pile in the corner of the barn grew. It grew from a small heap into a mound, then a hillock, then a small, sprawling mountain of discarded leather. It became a feature of the farm, as permanent as the old stone well or the sway-backed ridge of the barn roof. The seasons turned around it. Winter dustings of snow would settle on its peak through the gaps in the siding. Summer heat would bake it, releasing a strange, complex perfume of hide and salt and curing agents that permeated the entire structure. The smell became the smell of her barn. The pile became Abigail's folly. That's what they called it in town. Her father-in-law, a stern, practical man named Arthur Thorne, saw it as a monument to her stubbornness. He visited once a month, his buggy always immaculate, his posture rigid with disapproval. "You should sell this place, Abigail," he said, not for the first time, his gaze fixed on the leather mountain. He never looked directly at her when he said it. He looked at the barn, at the fields, at the life he thought was too much for her. A woman alone, this is no life. That pile of rubbish is proof you're overwhelmed, he gestured with his chin. What earthly purpose does it serve? She would just stand there, her hands tucked into the pockets of her apron, and offer no defense. How could she explain it? At first, she'd kept it out of a strange, misplaced loyalty to a deal Robert had made. Then, it became inertia. The wagon came, she accepted the delivery, she added it to the pile. To refuse it felt like more effort than to simply let it accumulate. But over time, a different feeling took root. It was a quiet curiosity. She would run her hands over the scraps. She noted the different thicknesses, the textures, the colors ranging from pale cream to deep, rich brown. She saw the marks of the tanner's trade, the scars and brands on the hide that told the story of an animal's life. It wasn't just trash. It was a vocabulary she didn't yet understand. It was potential, dormant and silent. It was a question waiting for an answer. The town could whisper. Her father-in-law could disapprove. But the pile remained. 9 years. 9 years the wagon came. The pile grew to weigh tons, a silent testament to industrial inefficiency and one woman's inexplicable patience. A resource, her husband had said. She just hadn't found the use for it. Not yet. Let me tell you about the day it broke. It was a simple thing. The tool belt she wore every day, the one that held her fencing pliers, a hammer, and a handful of nails, finally gave up. The leather, thin and poorly stitched from the day she'd bought it at Henderson's general store, had grown brittle with sun and sweat. As she leaned over to stretch a line of wire, a seam split, and the belt tore clean through. Her hammer thudded to the ground, followed by a cascade of nails scattering into the dust. She stood up, holding the two useless pieces in her hands. Frustration, hot and sharp, pricked at her. It was a small thing, but it was the culmination of 100 other small things. A leaky pump, a stubborn gate, the constant, grinding work of keeping the farm from falling apart around her. Everything she owned felt like it was in a state of managed decay. And this belt, this cheap, shoddy piece of equipment, was the final insult. It had cost her a full day's wages from selling eggs, and it hadn't even lasted 2 seasons. She stormed back to the barn, the broken belt still clutched in her fist, ready to begin the tedious task of trying to stitch it back together. As she stepped into the familiar cool and shadow, her eyes fell upon the pile. The mountain of leather. It seemed to loom larger in that moment, a silent, reproachful presence. 9 years of accumulation. 9 years of uselessness. And here she was, holding a broken tool belt made of leather so flimsy it felt like paper. The irony was so thick she could taste it. She walked over to the pile, the anger draining out of her, replaced by a slow, dawning thought. What was this leather, really? It was the strongest part of the hide, the thick, durable shell that protected an animal. The tannery threw it away because it was shaped wrong, not because it was weak. In fact, the opposite was true. These were the toughest, most resilient pieces. She dropped the broken belt onto the dusty floor. She reached out and picked up a piece of scrap from the top of the pile. It was a long, crescent-shaped piece of thick steer hide, dyed a dark walnut brown. It was stiff and unyielding in her hand. It was heavy. It was real. A resource, Robert had said. She looked from the scrap in her hand to the broken belt on the floor. A simple, radical idea began to form, not in a flash of lightning, but as a slow, quiet sunrise. Why mend something weak? Why buy something shoddy? Why, when she was standing on a mountain of the finest, toughest leather in the state? She could make her own. A better one. One that wouldn't break. The thought was so audacious, so far outside the bounds of her daily life, that she almost dismissed it. But she didn't. She stood there, in the quiet of the barn, with the smell of old leather all around her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the flicker of something other than tired resignation. She felt a spark of defiant purpose. Let me tell you about the work. It began not with a plan, but with a problem. The leather was impossibly tough. Her sewing needles, the ones she used for mending canvas and grain sacks, snapped against its surface. Her knives, sharpened for kitchen work and whittling, barely scratched it. This was not cloth. This was armor. The first week was a study in failure. She tried soaking the leather in water to soften it, only to find it became stiff as a board when it dried. She tried hammering a nail through it to make a hole for stitching, and the nail bent. Every evening, she would quit, her hands raw and aching, her progress measured in millimeters. The pile in the corner seemed to mock her, a vast reserve of impossibility. But Abigail Thorne was a farmer. Her entire life was a conversation with stubborn, unyielding things, dry soil, broken equipment, the relentless cycle of the seasons. She knew that brute force was rarely the answer. The answer was observation, patience, and the right tool. She started by watching. She spent hours just sorting through the pile, her hands learning the different tempers and weights of the hide. She learned to read the grain, to feel the difference between a piece from the shoulder versus a piece from the belly. She began to see not just scraps, but shapes. Pockets. Loop straps. The tools came next. She couldn't afford a leatherworker's kit, so she made her own. She took an old file from Robert's toolbox and, over the course of 3 painstaking days, ground it down on her sharpening stone into a sharp, diamond-pointed awl. She found a broken piece of a handsaw, heated it in the forge, and hammered it into a curved cutting tool which she honed to a razor's edge. She learned to skive, to thin the edges of the leather where they would join, creating a seam that was strong but not bulky. She taught herself to saddle stitch, using 2 needles and a single long piece of waxed thread, creating a locking stitch that would not unravel even if one thread broke. Her first attempt was monstrous. It was thick, lopsided, and stitched with all the grace of a battlefield suture. The pockets were uneven, the hammer loop was too tight. It was brutally, uncompromisingly ugly. But it was strong. She put it on. The thick leather was stiff against her waist. She loaded it with her tools. The weight felt solid, secure. She went out and spent the rest of the day mending the very fence she'd been working on when the old belt broke. She bent, she stretched, she twisted. The belt did not yield. It did not creak. It did not complain. It simply was. That evening, she sat on the barn steps, watching the sun set, feeling the satisfying heft of the belt still at her hips. It wasn't just a tool holder. It was a statement. It was the first thing she had made in years that was not a repair, but a creation. It was ugly, yes. But it was hers. And it would not break. Let me tell you about Samuel. He was a young man, barely 20, hired on for the season to help with the haying. He was quiet, with hands that seemed too large for his lanky frame and a way of watching things without seeming to stare. He spoke little, worked hard, and ate his lunch in the shade of the oak tree, alone. He had been working for Abigail for a month before he said a word about the belt. He'd seen her wearing the ugly, formidable prototype every day. He'd seen how she moved in it, the unconscious confidence it gave her as she worked. One afternoon, they were resetting a corner post, and Samuel's own flimsy canvas apron tore, spilling his staples onto the ground. He swore under his breath, a quiet, frustrated sound. Abigail just kept working, her movements economical and sure. Later, as they were cleaning tools in the barn, he finally spoke. His voice was hesitant. "That belt you wear," he said, nodding toward her waist. "It's sturdy." It was the highest form of praise he could offer. Abigail stopped wiping down a shovel and looked at him. She saw the genuine curiosity in his eyes. "I made it," she said simply. Samuel looked from her belt to the mountain of leather scraps in the corner. He didn't need to ask the next question. The connection was obvious. "Could you teach me?" he asked, the words coming out in a rush, as if he was afraid they'd get away from him. "My pa, he's a carpenter." "His belt breaks twice a year." Abigail considered him. She saw not just a farmhand, but a boy on the cusp of manhood who wanted to learn a skill, to make something of value. She saw an apprentice. "Tomorrow," she said. "After the chores are done." And so it began. Every evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the farm was settled into the quiet of dusk, they would work by lantern light in the barn. She taught him everything she had taught herself, her voice patient and low. She showed him how to choose the right piece of hide, how to read its strengths and weaknesses. She taught him the slow, methodical rhythm of the saddle stitch, the feel of the awl piercing the thick leather, the satisfying pull of the waxed thread locking into place. He was a fast learner. His large hands, which could be clumsy with small things, were steady and strong with the leather. He had a natural eye for symmetry and form. Where her first belt had been a brute force creation, Samuel's first was cleaner, his stitches more even. Together, they began to refine the design. They experimented with different pocket configurations, with wider straps for more comfort, with reinforced corners using small copper rivets they hammered by hand. They made a belt for Samuel's father. Then one for the blacksmith. Then another for a rancher who lived down the road. Each one was better than the last. The work was slow, but the pile of scraps began, for the first time, to shrink. It was no longer a mountain of waste. It was an inventory. It was a promise. Let me tell you about Mr. Henderson. He was a man who believed in the predictable flow of commerce. He owned the town's general store, a place of comforting clutter that smelled of coffee beans, kerosene, and bulk cloth. He sold goods that came in on the railroad, goods that were mass-produced and, most importantly, cheap. He liked things he could order from a catalog and sell at a reliable margin. He did not like surprises. So when Abigail Thorne walked into his store one morning carrying a tool belt, he was surprised. He was even more surprised when she set it on his counter. It was the 5th belt she and Samuel had made. Their best work yet. The leather was a deep oxblood, polished with beeswax until it had a low sheen. The stitches were perfect, tiny diamonds marching in flawless rows. The rivets gleamed. It was a piece of functional art. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," Abigail said. "I'd like you to consider selling these." Henderson picked it up. He felt the weight of it, the thickness of the hide. He ran a thumb over the stitching. He was a merchant, not a craftsman, but he could recognize quality. And this was quality of a kind he rarely saw. It was also a problem. It was local. It was handmade. It had no place in his inventory of cheap, replaceable goods from back east. He set it down with a soft thud. He looked at Abigail, a woman he'd known for years as a quiet widow struggling to keep her farm afloat. He saw her not as a producer, but as a customer. A poor one, at that. A condescending smile touched his lips. "Abigail," he said, his tone patient, as if explaining a complex truth to a child. "This is a very substantial item. Very well made. But it's not what people want." He tapped a finger on a flimsy, machine-stitched belt hanging from a hook behind the counter. It was made of thin, split-grain leather that would crack in a year. "Folk want cheap, Mrs. Thorne," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "They want something that does the job for a low price. They don't want that." He flicked his finger toward her creation, a gesture of dismissal. "How much would you even have to charge for such a thing?" Abigail had done the calculations. She knew the value of her time, of Samuel's. The number was high, but fair. She told him. Mr. Henderson laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, but it was worse. It was a dismissive, pitying laugh. "My dear woman," he said, shaking his head. "Nobody in this county will pay that for a tool belt. You're better off tending your chickens." Abigail looked at him. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply picked up her belt from the counter. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She met his gaze for a long moment. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice even. Then she turned and walked out of the store, the bell above the door tinkling softly behind her, leaving the merchant alone with his certainty. Let me tell you about the turning point. It didn't happen in a store. It happened in the mud and sawdust of a new construction site, the frame of a new bank rising in the center of town. The project was run by a crew from out of state, men who worked hard and valued their tools. The foreman was a big man named Peterson, known for his demanding nature and his intolerance for shoddy equipment. One afternoon, Peterson was up on the second-story joists when his own tool belt, a brand he'd used for years, gave out. The main pouch ripped open, sending a shower of expensive screws and fasteners down to the ground below. The entire crew heard his roar of frustration. That same day, Samuel's father, the carpenter, was on the site, hired to help with the finish work. He was wearing the belt Abigail and Samuel had made for him. It was 6 months old and looked better than the day he'd gotten it, the leather darkening to a rich patina, molded perfectly to the shape of his tools. Peterson stomped over, his face red with anger. "What in blazes is that you're wearing, Joseph?" he demanded, pointing at the belt. "Mine just split clean in two." Joseph stopped his work. He unbuckled the belt and handed it to the foreman. "Made by the widow Thorne," he said. "Up at the old Robert Thorne place." Peterson took it. The sheer substance of it surprised him. He tested the seams, pulled on the pockets, ran his hand over the smooth, thick hide. He compared it to the ruined belt he held in his other hand. There was no comparison. This wasn't just a tool belt, it was a piece of professional equipment, built by someone who understood the demands of the work. He handed it back to Joseph. "Where did you say she lives?" he asked, his tone shifting from anger to intense interest. The next evening, Peterson's buggy pulled into Abigail's yard. He didn't come to haggle or to browse. He came to buy. He bought one for himself and placed an order for 5 more for his senior crew members. He paid her price without a blink, counting out the cash into her hand. He didn't want cheap. He wanted something that wouldn't break. Word of mouth, you see, is a current that flows outside of established channels. It doesn't care about catalogs or general stores. It travels from one working man to another, a quiet endorsement of quality passed along with a nod and a word. After Peterson's crew got their belts, the local blacksmith wanted one. Then the freight men who worked the rail depot. Then a team of ranchers who were building a new line of fence that stretched for miles. They didn't come to her because she was a widow trying to get by. They came because she made the best tool belt they had ever seen. Suddenly, the evenings in the barn were not long enough. The trickle of orders became a steady stream. Abigail had to hire a young woman from a neighboring farm to help with the stitching. The quiet corner of her barn, once a repository for trash, was now a workshop, filled with the rhythmic scrape of cutters, the punch of the awl, and the low murmur of people engaged in focused, meaningful work. Let me tell you about growth. The demand changed the rhythm of the farm. The work was no longer confined to the evenings, it bled into the day. Abigail found herself spending more time at the cutting table than in the fields. The neat stacks of cut leather pieces grew taller, while the mountain of raw scraps in the corner began to shrink at an astonishing rate. What had taken 9 years to accumulate was being transformed, piece by piece, into capital. She and Samuel were no longer just making belts, they were building a system. They created patterns out of old tin, ensuring every pocket they cut was identical. They built a jig for spacing their stitches perfectly. They found a supplier for solid copper rivets, buying them in bulk. Every step of the process was examined, refined, and made more efficient, without ever sacrificing the quality that had started it all. The sound of hammering from the barn became as common as the crowing of the rooster. They were making 10 belts a week, then 15. The money, when it came, was startling. For years, she had lived on the thin margins of a small farm, counting every penny, deferring every repair. Now, she had a cash box with a healthy weight to it. The first thing she did was hire a full-time hand to manage the farm, freeing herself and Samuel to focus solely on the leatherwork. The second was to fix the pump on the well. The third was to buy a new team of mules. These were not luxuries, they were investments back into the foundation of her life. She was shoring up the walls that had been crumbling for years. The business was given a name. She called it Thornbuilt. Simple. Honest. It was her name, and it was a promise. Each belt had the name stamped into the main strap with a set of steel dies she had the blacksmith make for her. A Thornbuilt belt was a guarantee. It would not fail you. The pile of scrap, once a symbol of her stagnation, was now the engine of her prosperity. The Tannery wagon still came every Tuesday, but its arrival was no longer a passive event. It was a delivery of raw materials. She would meet the driver, inspect the sacks, and direct him where to unload the specific types of hide she needed. She was no longer a recipient of trash, she was a customer selecting her stock. The transformation was total. The quiet widow who ran a struggling farm had become the proprietor of a thriving workshop. She didn't change. Her voice was still quiet, her movements still measured. But there was a new stillness in her, a confidence that came not from pride, but from competence. She had faced a problem, she had studied it, and she had built an answer with her own 2 hands. Let me tell you about the day Mr. Henderson came back. It was nearly 2 years after she had first walked into his store. His buggy looked the same, but the man who stepped out of it did not. His usual air of smug certainty was gone, replaced by a look of strained humility. He walked up to the barn, his hat held in his hands, and stood in the doorway, blinking in the sudden dimness. The scene inside was not what he expected. The mountain of scrap was nearly gone, replaced by organized stacks of cut leather. Samuel was at one bench, hammering rivets with a steady, rhythmic tap-tap-tap. A young woman Abigail had hired sat near the window, her needle flashing as she stitched a seam. Abigail herself stood at a large cutting table, a curved knife in her hand. The place hummed with quiet, productive energy. "Mrs. Thorne," Henderson began, his voice uncertain. She looked up from her work, her expression neutral. She did not smile. She simply waited. I have been getting requests," he said, stumbling over the words. "For your belts. Every day, it seems, someone comes in asking for a Thorne built." He paused, swallowing his pride. "My usual supplier, the quality is not what it used to be. The complaints are constant." He took a hesitant step into the barn. "I was wrong," he said, the admission costing him dearly. "I would be honored to carry your product in my store." Abigail wiped her blade on a piece of felt and set it down carefully. She walked over to him, her footsteps silent on the dusty floorboards. She looked him in the eye. For a moment, she thought of all the things she could say. She could remind him of his laughter, of his condescending tone. She could refuse him outright. But that wasn't her way. She was a builder, not a demolisher. She thought of his words from that day, 2 years ago. And she decided to use them. "Folk want cheap, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice soft, but with an edge of steel. The words landed with the weight of a hammer blow. He visibly flinched, the memory clear in his mind. "That's what you told me. I was wrong," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "They want quality. They want this." He gestured around the workshop. Abigail let the silence stretch. She was no longer the supplicant. She was the supplier. She held all the power. "My price is the same," she said finally. "And I sell to you on the same terms as I sell to anyone else. Payment upon receipt. No credit, of course," he said quickly. "Whatever you say." Later that day, as she watched Henderson's buggy disappear down the road, her father-in-law, Arthur, arrived for his monthly visit. He had seen Henderson leave. He looked at the bustling workshop, at the dwindling pile of scraps, at the confidence on his daughter-in-law's face. He walked over to a finished belt hanging from a hook, identical to the one she'd shown the storekeeper. He tested the seams. He felt the weight of it. He turned to her, and for the first time in the 9 years since his son's death, he gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was not praise. It was not an apology. It was something more valuable. It was respect. Let me tell you about the end of the story, which is, of course, not the end at all. 5 more years passed. The barn was expanded, a new wing added to house more workbenches and better lighting. Thorne Built was no longer just a local name. Their belts were being shipped by rail to towns and cities she had only ever seen on a map. The pile of scraps was long gone. In its place were neat, orderly stacks of prime leather, purchased directly from the Tannery, which now saw her as one of its most valued clients. The $500,000 mark was a quiet one. It wasn't a single event, but an accountant's calculation, the slow, steady accumulation of profit from tens of thousands of belts sold. It was an impossible number, a figure that would have seemed like a wild fantasy to the woman who once worried about the price of chicken feed. Yet, it was real. Abigail still worked at her cutting table, though she no longer needed to. The work was in her hands, in her bones. Samuel was now her foreman, a capable and confident man who ran the day-to-day operations of the workshop. He had married the young woman who had been their first stitcher, and they had a small house just down the road. One afternoon, Abigail stood at the hayloft window, the same window from which she had watched the first Tannery wagon arrive all those years ago. The view was the same, the long dirt road, the fields, the distant line of hills. But everything that view represented had changed. The road that had once brought her trash now brought her prosperity. She turned and looked back into the workshop. On a small shelf above her workbench, protected from the dust, sat a single piece of leather. It was an odd, triangular scrap, the very first one she had picked up from the pile that first day. It was her reminder. A symbol of a journey. A testament to her husband's quiet wisdom. Waste is just a resource you haven't found a use for yet. Just then, a young man appeared in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. He was tall and lanky, with the same oversized hands as his older brother. It was Samuel's younger brother, just arrived in town. He looked around the bustling workshop with wide, hopeful eyes. He looked at Abigail. "My brother sent me," he said, his voice full of youthful earnestness. He said you might have work for me. I want to learn." Abigail looked at the boy, and in him, she saw the future. She saw the continuation of the story. She saw the next generation ready to take the resources before them and build something strong, something honest, something that would last. She gave him a small, quiet smile. "Let's find you an apron," she said.